A single mom spent her last coins on bread. Then the CEO said, "Get more, I'll pay." The morning air over Crescent Bay was sharp and cold, the kind that made every breath taste like salt. A pale mist drifted over the harbor as boats rocked against their moorings, ropes creaking softly. Inside a small grocery store near the docks, Lena Ward stood in front of the counter, her fingers trembling as she emptied her pockets. Coins rolled across her palm, nickels, dimes, one faded quarter. It wasn't enough. The cashier, a tired woman with red hands, gave her a look halfway between pity and impatience. "That'll be $4.75, ma'am." I think I have more," Lena said quickly, digging into her worn canvas bag. Her fingers brushed against lint, an old receipt, Mason's toy car, nothing else. The little boy's voice echoed in her head from that morning. "Mom, will there still be breakfast?" He'd been coughing again, his cheeks flushed with fever. She'd told him yes, of course there would be. A mother couldn't afford to say maybe. Behind her, the line began to shift. Someone coughed, another sighed loudly. Lena swallowed hard, her face heating as she glanced at the loaf of bread and the small carton of milk sitting on the counter. "Could you please take off the butter?" she asked softly. The cashier nodded, but before she could touch the register, a low, calm voice spoke from behind Lena. "No need to take anything off," the man said. "Get more. I'll pay for everything." The store seemed to fall still. Lena turned around slowly. A tall man stood a few steps away, dressed in a dark wool coat. His hair was damp from the fog outside, and his eyes were the gray blue of the ocean in winter. Steady, unreadable. He looked out of place in the small store, yet completely at ease, like someone who was used to silence. "Excuse me?" Lena managed to say. "I can't let you." But he had already stepped forward, setting a small basket on the counter. "Add these," he told the cashier. "Another loaf, honey, children's cough syrup, and—" His eyes flicked to the carton of milk. "Make that 2. The cashier hesitated only a second before scanning the items. The man handed over a sleek black card, his movements unhurried. "Sir, that's too much," Lena whispered, clutching the handle of her bag. "I don't even know your name." "Julian," he said simply, eyes still on the register screen. "Just Julian." When the transaction was done, he turned to her and placed the paper bag gently in her hands. "The little one. He has a cough, right? Warm milk with honey will help until you can see a doctor." There was no condescension in his voice, only a quiet certainty that made her throat tighten. "Thank you," she said, after a long pause. The words felt too small. "You don't have to." "I already did," he replied. His tone was calm, almost distant, but something flickered in his expression when he looked at her raw, chapped fingers clutching the paper bag. As he started to leave, she noticed a folded receipt left on top of the counter. When she picked it up, a small handwritten note peeked from underneath. "If your boy needs help, call this number, JH. No company name, no address, just a local phone number." She looked up to call out, but he was already gone. The glass door swung shut behind him, the little bell above it chiming once. Outside, the fog had thickened, blurring his figure as he walked toward the harbor street. For a long moment, Lena stood frozen. Then the world around her moved again. The beep of the next customer's scanner, the hum of the freezer, the faint whistle of wind sneaking through the doorway. She tucked the note into her coat pocket and hurried outside, the paper bag pressed to her chest. The cold air stung her cheeks. Her breath came out in clouds as she walked the narrow lane back toward the harbor. The grocery bag felt heavier than it should. 2 loaves of bread, 2 cartons of milk, a bottle of cough syrup, and one unfamiliar kindness she didn't know how to carry. By the time she reached the small, weather-beaten building where she and Mason lived, her fingers were stiff from the cold. The sign Room 7 hung crooked on the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and damp wood. The tiny heater in the corner buzzed weakly. Mason lay curled on the thin mattress, his hair damp with sweat. Lena knelt beside him, brushing his cheek with the back of her hand. "I got you something," she whispered, setting the bread and milk beside him. He stirred but didn't wake. When she finally sat down, the exhaustion hit her all at once. Her eyes drifted to the note sticking out from her pocket. The ink was smudged from her fingers, but the number was still clear. She stared at it, unsure whether to feel grateful or suspicious. Strangers didn't do things like this, not in her world. Outside, the wind from the bay howled through the gaps in the old window frame. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. Lena pulled the blanket over Mason and pressed the paper closer to her heart. Maybe she wouldn't call the number. Maybe she would. For now, she had bread, milk, and the faint, unfamiliar warmth of someone's kindness to get through the night. The wind off Crescent Bay had turned sharper by evening. Waves slapped against the pilings, and every gust found its way through the cracks of the old boarding house. In room 7, the small heater buzzed weakly against the cold, but the air still smelled of damp wood and salt. Lena knelt beside the mattress where Mason lay half asleep, his cheeks flushed red, his breathing shallow. She pressed a damp towel to his forehead, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Just rest." The towel was cool for a moment, then warmed quickly against his burning skin. Outside, rain began to tap against the window in uneven rhythms. She had meant to go to the pharmacy, but the few dollars she'd saved had already gone to rent. When she checked the paper bag from the grocery store again, her eyes caught the small bottle of cough syrup the man, Julian, had added. She read the label, then measured a spoonful carefully and lifted it to Mason's lips. The child swallowed with a small whimper, then curled back under the blanket, clutching the edge with his thin fingers. A drop of water fell from the ceiling, landing on the floor beside the bed. Then another. Lena placed a pan under the leak and sat down on the edge of the mattress. Her eyes stung from exhaustion. She had worked 3 nights in a row gutting fish at the plant, and every muscle in her back throbbed. She looked toward the small heater, watching its orange coil dim and brighten, as if struggling to stay alive. Her thoughts drifted to the man at the store. "Julian," he had said. Just Julian. The way he'd spoken, calm, certain, like kindness was something ordinary, didn't fit the world she knew. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded note he'd left. The ink had bled slightly from the damp air, but the number was still readable. For a long minute, she stared at it, her thumb tracing over the initials JH. She whispered to herself, "Don't be stupid, Lena. People don't just help for no reason." Yet when Mason coughed again, deeper this time, she made her choice. She picked up the small phone lying beside the bed, its screen cracked, and dialed the number. The call rang once, then twice. A man's voice answered, calm and steady. "Julian Hale speaking." Her breath caught. It's me, Lena. You helped me at the store this morning." "I remember," he said without hesitation. "How's your son?" "He's sick. The medicine helped a little, but..." She stopped, unsure how to continue. "I didn't mean to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Julian replied quietly. "Just tell me where you are." I can't pay for anything," she said quickly. "I just thought maybe you'd know what to..." "I'll send someone," he interrupted gently. "You'll need to give me your address. Please confirm I can send a nurse there tonight." The words sounded too professional, too certain to argue with. "Room 7, Harbor House Inn," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And thank you." "Stay with your son," he said. "You've done enough tonight." The line clicked off. Lena stared at the phone, unsure if she had imagined the whole thing. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Rain hammered the window harder now, wind howling through the gaps. She was about to convince herself it had been a mistake when a soft knock came at the door. She hesitated, heart racing. "Who is it?" "Community care," a woman's voice called. "Mr. Hale sent me." When Lena opened the door, a nurse in a navy raincoat stood there, holding a small medical bag and a thermos that steamed in the cold air. She moved with quiet efficiency, checking Mason's temperature, listening to his chest, jotting notes on a pad. "He's weak, but the fever should break by morning," the nurse said gently. "Make sure he drinks water and stays warm. Here, some extra cough syrup on the house." Lena wanted to ask who had arranged this, but her voice failed her. The nurse smiled faintly, as if understanding. "You have a good friend, Ms. Ward." After she left, Lena closed the door and leaned against it, the sound of the rain softening outside. On the table beside the medicine lay another paper, an information leaflet titled "Rebuild Together, Skills Training for Single Parents." At the bottom, in small print, were the words, "Supported by the Hale Foundation." She sank into the old chair, the leaflet trembling in her hands. She didn't know what the Hale Foundation was, or why a man like him had cared enough to send help. All she knew was that her boy was breathing easier now, his fever fading, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Lena poured some warm milk from the thermos into a chipped cup, took a sip, and let the heat spread through her. The world outside still howled, but inside that room, for the first time in weeks, she felt a fragile peace settle over her. As she turned off the lamp, her eyes lingered once more on the folded note resting near the phone. Maybe tomorrow, she thought, she'd learn what kind of man left his initials on a scrap of paper, and what Hale Foundation really meant. By morning, the storm had passed. Thin streaks of sunlight slipped through the cracks in the blinds, painting soft lines across the room. The air inside was still damp, but quieter now, carrying only the faint hum of the heater and the slow, even breathing of Mason, who was finally sleeping without fever. Lena sat at the edge of the bed, holding the leaflet the nurse had left the night before. The paper was creased and slightly smudged, but the words stood out clearly. "Rebuild Together, Skills Training and Support for Single Parents." Underneath, in small print, "Supported by the Hale Foundation." She traced the logo with her finger, the same last name as the man from the grocery store. Her heart tugged with cautious curiosity. By noon, she was walking through the narrow streets of Crescent Bay with the folded paper in her pocket. The community center was only a 15-minute walk from the harbor, a sturdy brick building with a peeling sign that read Crescent Community Hall. She hesitated at the entrance, self-conscious about her frayed coat and the faint salt stains on her boots. Inside, the smell of sawdust and coffee filled the air. A small group of people gathered around long wooden tables stacked with tools and half-finished furniture pieces. A woman in her 40s approached with a warm smile. "You must be Lena," she said, glancing at the sign-up sheet. "We got your call this morning. Welcome to Rebuild Together. I'm Dana." Lena blinked. "You already had my name? Mr. Hale mentioned someone might stop by." Dana said it casually, as if she didn't realize those words made Lena's pulse skip. Julian. The name carried an unfamiliar weight now. Gratitude mixed with something like unease. Lena forced a small smile. "I just wanted to see what this is." Dana gestured toward the room. "We help parents learn practical skills, basic carpentry, repairs, design. It's all part of rebuilding confidence, not just furniture." The phrase made Lena's chest tighten. Rebuilding confidence. It had been years since anyone had used that word around her. They started with introductions. Most were mothers like her. A young woman escaping a bad marriage, another raising twins after losing her husband. There were a few fathers too, quiet, tired, hopeful. The instructor handed out small pieces of wood for practice cuts. When it was Lena's turn, she hesitated, gripping the handle of the small saw like it might break in her hands. Her first cut went crooked. A small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "Guess I'm better at sewing nets than sawing wood." "That's okay," Dana said gently. "We're not building perfection here. We're building courage." The hours slipped by. By the end of the day, she had made something small. A rough picture frame, uneven but standing. Mason would like it, she thought. Maybe he could put one of his paper boats inside. When she returned the tools, she noticed movement near the back of the room. A tall figure stood by the window, half hidden by sunlight. The familiar dark coat, Julian. For a second, she froze, unsure whether to speak. He was talking quietly to Dana, nodding as she handed him a clipboard. Then his eyes lifted and met hers. The room seemed to fade. He walked over, slow and steady. "You came," he said softly, as though he had expected she might not. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I thought maybe this was charity." Julian shook his head. "Charity ends when the money runs out. Opportunity doesn't." He glanced at the crooked frame in her hands. "You made that today?" She looked down, embarrassed. "It's not much. It's a start," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes lingered on the rough corners of the frame with something close to pride. "You'll be surprised what you can build once you stop counting what's missing." A soft whistle blew, signaling the end of class. People began to pack up, laughter filling the room. Julian handed Lena a small block of wood, polished smooth, with words carved in neat letters. "Hope begins here." She traced the words, feeling the warmth of the grain beneath her fingertips. "You give this to everyone?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Only to those who've already started." Then he nodded once and turned back toward the hallway. As he left, sunlight spilled across the floor, catching in the dust like gold. Lena stood there for a long time, the wooden piece pressed to her palm. It wasn't just a token, it felt like a promise. That night, back in her small room, she set the wooden block on the windowsill beside Mason's bed. The light from the harbor shimmered faintly through the cracked glass, casting a soft glow over his sleeping face. She whispered to herself, "Maybe this is where it changes." Outside, the sea murmured like an old friend, and for the first time in years, Lena fell asleep before the heater shut off. The days after Lena's first class passed like a slow tide, steady and quiet. Each morning she walked Mason to the small daycare near the docks, his little hand tucked inside hers, his cough fading with each passing day. Then she would make her way to the community center, the one place that now smelled less like sawdust and more like hope. The Rebuild Together workshop had become her small routine, something that gave shape to days that used to blur together. On Wednesday, the sunlight came early, streaming through the high windows of the workshop. Lena slipped into her usual spot near the back table and ran her hand along the smooth plank she'd been sanding. It was warm under her fingertips, the smell of pine clinging to the air. Around her, other participants chatted softly, laughing at crooked shelves and uneven chairs. It was the kind of laughter she hadn't heard in years. Simple, unguarded. Dana, the instructor, walked around offering guidance, but today Lena noticed someone else standing near the door. Julian. He wasn't wearing his dark coat this time. Instead, a gray sweater and rolled-up sleeves made him look less like the polished stranger from the store and more like someone who belonged there. He carried a clipboard, listening to Dana's updates, nodding occasionally. When his eyes met Lena's, he gave a small, almost shy smile. She quickly looked back at her work, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks. Later, when everyone broke for coffee, she found herself alone at the table, adjusting the legs of her half-built stool. A shadow fell across her workspace. "Mind if I help?" Julian asked. His voice was quieter in person, like he was careful not to intrude. She hesitated, then nodded. He crouched beside her, examining the uneven joint she'd been struggling with. "The trick is to line up the grain before you tighten the screws," he said. He guided her hand toward the right angle, steady but not overbearing. "There. See? Stronger already." Lena exhaled slowly. "Guess I've been forcing things the wrong way." "Most people do," he said. "Wood's not so different from people. Push too hard and it breaks." The line made her smile despite herself. "You sound like you've done this before." "Not in a long time," he replied, brushing the sawdust off his palms. "My mother used to work with wood. She said it kept her sane." His voice softened on that last word. "She passed away when I was 20. Pneumonia." Lena froze. "I'm sorry." He nodded. She lived in a small house down by the docks. The roof leaked every winter. I told myself I'd fix it, but I was too late. The memory seemed to hang between them. The sound of hammers and chatter faded, replaced by the soft ticking of rain against the distant windows. Lena tightened her grip on the stool's leg. That's why you started all this, isn't it? Rebuild together. Julian looked at her for a long moment before answering. Partly. I wanted to build homes that don't fall apart when people need them most. He gave a faint, tired smile. And maybe I wanted to fix something in myself, too. For a while, neither spoke. Lena focused on fitting the final screw, and he held the stool steady. When it finally stood upright, solid and balanced, she couldn't help a small laugh of triumph. Julian smiled too, a quiet, genuine curve of his mouth. Told you it'd hold. Just then, Mason came running in, clutching something small in his hands. A shell he had found by the beach on his way from daycare. "Mom, look, it's shiny," he said proudly. Julian crouched down to eye level with the boy. "That's a nice shell," he said, turning it gently between his fingers. The sunlight caught on its smooth surface. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small engraving tool from his toolkit. "How about I make it special?" Mason watched wide-eyed as Julian etched one simple word onto the back, home. Then he handed it back carefully. "Keep this close. Whenever the wind gets too strong, remember where you belong." Mason grinned and ran off to show Dana. Lena watched the interaction quietly, her chest tightening with something she didn't quite recognize. Gratitude, maybe, or trust sneaking in where fear used to live. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. "I know," Julian said softly, "but some things are worth the time." When class ended, Lena lingered, packing her tools slowly. Julian was near the door, talking with a volunteer. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at her once more. "You're doing better than you think, Lena," he said. "Don't quit before the walls start to stand." She didn't answer right away. She just nodded, watching him step out into the fading afternoon light. Through the window, she saw him pause to help an elderly man carry lumber to a truck before disappearing down the street. That evening, back in her room, Mason placed the shell on the nightstand beside her wooden block. "Hope begins here." Lena stared at the two small objects glowing in the lamplight. A piece of wood and a seashell, both carrying the same message in different words. She brushed a strand of hair from Mason's forehead, whispering, "Maybe we're starting to rebuild too." The next morning arrived with the smell of coffee and the sound of rain returning to Crescent Bay. Lena wrapped Mason's scarf twice around his neck before walking him to the daycare. The boy held his seashell tightly, the word home carved into the back gleaming faintly under the gray sky. "Don't forget to show Donna your drawing today," she said. He nodded, his breath puffing in small clouds. When she kissed his forehead goodbye, he whispered, "Are you building again today, Mommy?" "Every day," she answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. At the workshop, the mood was bright. Someone had brought pastries, and the smell of cinnamon filled the air. Lena joined the others at the long table, smoothing sandpaper over the small chest she'd been making. The sound of tools clinking against wood gave her comfort. She was beginning to feel like she belonged here, surrounded by people who had all been broken once but were learning how to put things back together. Halfway through the morning, Dana entered holding a rolled-up newspaper. "Did you all see this?" she asked, waving it playfully. "We made the news. The program's in the local paper." Everyone cheered, a ripple of excitement running through the room. "Page 3, someone called. Dana spread the newspaper open on the table, and there it was. Rebuild Together helps families find a second chance. But when Lena leaned closer, her breath caught. The photograph showed Julian standing beside a group of parents in the workshop, his arm slightly behind her, eyes turned toward the camera. In front, Mason sat on the workbench, holding his shell in both hands. Beneath the photo, the caption read, "CEO Julian Hale of Hale & Koenig gives hope to single parents rebuilding their lives." For a moment, the words didn't sink in. CEO, Hale & Co., the same name printed on the foundation logo, The same initials on that folded note, J.H. The man who had paid for her groceries, who sent the nurse, who showed up in a workshop wearing rolled sleeves, was the head of a multi-million-dollar construction company, a CEO known for building towers in Portland, the same company she'd heard accused of abandoning a low-income housing project 2 years ago. Lena felt her hands go cold. Around her, the others were still laughing, taking pictures of the article, proud to see their names in print. But to her, the room suddenly felt smaller. Dana looked up. "Isn't it great? He's been so involved. Such a blessing for this town." Lena forced a nod and excused herself, stepping outside into the drizzle. The air smelled of wet wood and metal. She walked toward the edge of the parking lot, her breath uneven. She pulled out her phone and searched Julian Hale Crescent Bay. Dozens of results appeared. CEO returns home after scandal. Critics question redemption project. Community outreach or image repair? The words blurred together until she couldn't read anymore. That evening, Mason was drawing at the table when she came in. "Look, Mommy," he said proudly. "I drew our new house, with windows that don't leak." She smiled weakly, tucking his hair behind his ear. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." When he went to bed, she sat alone by the small lamp, scrolling through more articles. Photos of Julian at charity events, press releases about the foundation, headlines calling him the rebranding face of second chances. The same phrase he had once said to her, "Opportunity doesn't end when the money runs out." It all sounded rehearsed now, practiced. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You weren't at the workshop today. Is everything okay, Jay?" She stared at the message for a long time, then typed back. "I saw the article. I didn't know who you really were." The reply came quickly. "I was going to tell you. Not like this." "Why not?" she typed. "Why wait until someone else did it for you?" A pause, then. "Because I didn't want your gratitude to turn into fear. I just wanted you to have a chance." Lena read the words twice. Then she turned the phone face down on the table, her pulse pounding in her ears. She thought of the day at the store, the quiet man who had bought bread without asking for anything. She thought of the shell in Mason's hand, of the wooden block that said, "Hope begins here." What if none of it was real? What if she was just another story? A photo to prove he could change. The next morning, the sky broke open in heavy rain. She walked to the workshop, carrying Mason's drawing under her coat. The room was nearly empty when she arrived. Julian was there, standing by the window, the newspaper folded neatly on his desk. He looked up when she entered. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was steady but low. "I thought if you knew, you'd see the man everyone else sees, not the one who meant what he said to you." She set the drawing down on the table between them. "I wanted to believe this was about building something honest," she said. "Not about fixing your reputation." He took a step closer, rainwater dripping from his coat. "It was never about that." Then what was it about? Julian hesitated. The answer caught somewhere behind his tired eyes. But before he could speak, she turned away, voice trembling. "I can't be part of your story, Julian. I already spent too long being someone else's." She walked out into the storm without looking back, the sound of her footsteps fading against the rain-soaked pavement. Inside the workshop, Julian stood motionless, the newspaper headline staring up at him from the table. The same words that had brought her here, and the same ones that had just driven her away. Rain fell in sheets that night, turning the streets of Crescent Bay into silver ribbons. Lena walked fast through the downpour, her coat clinging to her shoulders, Mason's drawing pressed under her arm. By the time she reached their small room at Harbor House Inn, she was shivering. The room was quiet except for the hiss of the heater and the soft rattle of the window pane. Mason was asleep, his seashell resting on the nightstand beside the wooden block that said, "Hope begins here." The sight of those two small tokens made her chest ache. She sat down, wiping the rain from her face. Her phone buzzed twice on the table, both messages from Julian. "Please talk to me. I owe you the truth. She stared at the screen but didn't reply. The rain kept falling, louder now, until exhaustion finally pulled her into uneasy sleep. The next afternoon, the storm broke. The sky turned a pale gray blue, the kind that always came before sunset. Lena took Mason down to the beach after school, hoping the fresh air would calm her thoughts. He ran ahead, his boots leaving small prints in the wet sand. "Mom, look!" he shouted, bending to pick something up. He turned around with a wide grin and held out his seashell. "It still says home." The waves hissed behind him, and the wind tugged at his hood. She managed to smile, though her heart felt heavier than the clouds above them. That was when she saw someone standing farther down the shoreline, a tall figure in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, facing the sea. Julian. For a moment, Lena considered turning back, but Mason had already spotted him and was waving. "That's Mr. Julian," he said, running toward him before she could stop him. Julian turned at the sound of the child's voice. His expression softened. He knelt down as Mason approached, holding up the small shell proudly. "See? You wrote this," Mason said. Julian smiled faintly and touched the edge of the shell. "Looks like it's still keeping its promise." Lena finally caught up, breathless, her voice guarded. "You shouldn't have come here." "I know," Julian said quietly, "but I had to." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. Mason's seashell, the one he'd given before, now cleaned and glistening, a small crack mended with a thin line of gold lacquer. "He dropped this by the pier last week," Julian said. "I wanted to return it." Lena frowned, her tone sharp. "You think fixing a shell makes everything better?" "No," he said, looking at the horizon where the tide was rolling in. "But maybe it's a start." He paused before speaking again. "You were right. I should have told you who I was. I was a coward. I thought if you knew my name, everything would feel false. I didn't want you to see me as someone who ruined things before trying to rebuild them." The wind carried his words away, but Lena didn't move. She crossed her arms tightly. "I don't even know what's real anymore, Julian. The program, the job, the help, was any of it about me or just about fixing your image?" Julian's eyes flickered with pain. "It was never about my image. It was about a promise I made 30 years ago." She looked up, uncertain. "A promise?" He nodded slowly. "When I was 7, I lived down by the docks. Before Hale and Company, before anything. My mother left me one night. She said she'd be right back, but she never came. I waited until it rained, hungry and cold, sitting near the harbor steps. That's when a woman found me. Poor, tired, but kind. She gave me a piece of bread and told me, 'If you're still alive tomorrow, help someone the way you were helped today.'" His voice cracked, barely audible. "I never even learned her name, but she looked like you. Same eyes, same strength." Lena stood still, the sound of waves filling the silence between them. "So that's why you help people like me," she said quietly. He nodded. "I built towers for years, but none of them ever felt like redemption. Then I came back here, trying to build homes that didn't leak, for other families, for children who still wait by doors that never open. You reminded me why that mattered again." Her anger began to slip away, replaced by something softer, deeper. "You think one good act can erase all the mistakes?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "It just proves they don't have to be the ending." Mason tugged at Lena's sleeve then, holding both shells, the old one and the mended one, side by side. "Look, Mommy, they fit together now." Julian smiled faintly. "He's right." Lena looked down at the shells, one etched with home, the other sealed with gold. The setting sun cast a warm glow across them, turning the cracks into lines of light. She met Julian's gaze, the fight slowly leaving her eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said. "I'm not asking you to," he replied. "I just don't want the story to end here." The tide reached their feet, washing away the footprints around them. For the first time, Lena didn't step back. She looked toward the horizon and whispered, "Maybe it doesn't have to." A year passed, and Crescent Bay no longer looked like the place Lena once walked through with her head down. The winter storms had given way to sunlight that lingered longer over the water, and the air now carried the scent of cedar and paint instead of damp salt. At the corner of Main Street stood a new building with wide windows and soft yellow walls, the Lighthouse Project. The sign above the entrance swayed gently in the breeze, its carved letters catching the afternoon light. Inside, laughter echoed through the halls. Children's drawings covered every wall. Houses, stars, paper boats, and smiling stick figures holding hands. At one of the tables near the back, Mason, now 7, was painting a wooden frame bright blue. His small hands moved carefully, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. "You missed a spot," Lena teased, kneeling beside him with a rag tucked in her apron. Her hands were smudged with charcoal and sawdust. She wore a simple blue shirt rolled to her elbows, her hair tied up in a loose knot. Mason giggled. "I like it messy. It looks real." Across the room, Julian stood talking to Dana, who now managed the center's programs. He wore no suit, just a white shirt with sleeves rolled high, sawdust on his forearm. His life had changed as quietly as hers had. He spent more time here than at any boardroom, trading contracts for paintbrushes and spreadsheets for blueprints of new community homes. When he caught Lena's gaze, he smiled, the kind of smile that still made her heart stumble for a moment before steadying again. It had been slow, this rebuilding, slower than either of them had expected. After that day on the beach, they didn't rush back into each other's lives. Trust had taken time, shaped day by day like the wood they sanded together. Julian had started the Lighthouse Project with a simple mission: to help single parents learn trades, find work, and more importantly, find belonging. He asked Lena to be part of it, not out of charity, but because he believed she could teach what she had lived. How to start again when everything seemed broken. Now she was one of the program's mentors, guiding new parents through the same workshop where she once stood uncertain. Every morning, she unlocked the doors before sunrise, letting the first light spill across the tables. Every evening, she watched families leave with smiles and warm meals. It wasn't perfect, but it was good. It was real. "Mommy, look," Mason said, holding up his frame proudly. Inside it, he had placed a drawing of a little house made of seashells. At the bottom, in his crooked handwriting, were the words, "Our home." Lena smiled and kissed the top of his head. "It's beautiful," she whispered. The seashell Julian had mended months ago still sat on the center's front desk, a quiet symbol of what they had learned, that even cracks could be part of something strong. Later that evening, when the last class ended, Lena stood outside on the porch, watching the sunset bleed orange over the harbor. Julian stepped beside her, handing her a mug of tea. "You did good work today," he said. "So did you," she replied, glancing at him. "You're finally learning how to rest." He chuckled softly. "Still working on that." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the gulls calling over the water. Then Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a brass key attached to a simple ring. "What's this?" she asked. He turned it in his hand, the light catching on the engraved words. "One loaf of bread can rebuild a home." "It's for the new art room," he said. "But maybe it's also for you, for everything you built here." Lena took the key, her eyes misting. "I didn't build this alone." Julian shook his head. "No, you just showed me where to start." From inside, Mason's laughter rang out, clear and bright. The lights of the building spilled onto the street, glowing like a beacon against the deepening dusk. Lena looked at the sign above the door, the Lighthouse Project, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. "It's funny," she said quietly. "All this began because of a loaf of bread." Julian's gaze softened. "Because of someone who refused to let another go hungry," he said. She smiled, her voice gentle. "Maybe kindness really does come back, just not always to the same hands." He reached for her hand then, not rushing, just steady, the way he had built everything else with her. Their fingers met, and neither let go. Inside, Mason ran to the window and waved, holding his blue picture frame high for them to see. The glass caught the glow of the lamps inside, making it shimmer like sunlight on the water. Lena squeezed Julian's hand and whispered, "We're home." The tide whispered against the pier. The lights of Crescent Bay twinkled to life, and the little building that had risen from hunger, hurt, and hope stood quietly at the corner. Proof that even one act of compassion could rebuild more than walls. It could rebuild hearts. If this story touched your heart, if you believe kindness can rebuild what the world breaks, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Midus Stories. Every click helps us bring more stories of hope, second chances, and love that begins with one simple act.